use.
Case study 2 is about an IPR transfer, a brand. So the facts are as under. There is a parent company in Japan. The name of the parent company is Noren, and Noren stands for goodwill in Japanese language. You have an Indian company which is Pratishta, and there is one more Indian subsidiary which is Pralok. Currently, the Indian subsidiary named Pratishta is using one couple of brands, Navaratna brand, in fact one brand. And the Japanese company has given the right to the Indian subsidiary Pratishta to use that brand in India. The brand being owned by the Japanese company is of course registered in Japan, but this brand is also registered in Bombay and Navi Mumbai and Delhi. From the perspective of direct tax, that's not relevant how many places it is registered, but yes, it is registered in India. Pratishta desires to buy that brand from including transfer of certain manuals, research and development efforts, etc. And of course, what the Japanese company has agreed is that yes, I will sell you the India rights. So the global ownership of the brand and IPR and manuals would continue to be owned by the Japanese company except for the Indian territory. So for the Indian territory, Pratishta would become the owner of those brands. Typically, after transfer of the brands, Noren of course will apply for cancellation of the registration at the Indian Trademark Office, and I presume subsequently Pratishta would register that brand in its own name in India. Noren also has a wholly owned subsidiary Pralokan, and it is desired that Pratishta would then merge into Pralokan, and after merging there would be a single entity left in India which would be Pralokan. In consideration of the merger, Pralokan would issue shares to the shareholder of Pratishta, which is again the Japanese parent company. And it is stated that the difference between the consideration and the net asset value as per the books, that would be recorded as goodwill. That is the brief facts of the case study number 2. The question is, what is the tax implication? And of course, we will briefly discuss the direct tax implications first on Noren being the Japanese company, then on Pratishta and Pralok. Let's take the first transaction. The first transaction is that today Pratishta might be paying certain royalty to the Japanese company. That would clearly be a royalty on which appropriate withholding tax would be deducted. So that is a very, very simple aspect, nothing to be discussed. The second aspect is what happens when the Japanese company is selling the brand for the Indian territory to the Indian company. The question is, the income earned by the Japanese company, would it be taxable in India or not? First, the characterization of that income is likely to be capital gains. Having characterized the income, the second question is, does it accrue under Section 5 or does it deem to accrue under Section 9? Section 5, the natural accruals talks about income which naturally accrues in India. And the question to be deliberated is that because the brand was exploited in India for a couple of years, can it be said that there is a natural accrual of income in India in the hands of the Japanese company? If the answer to this question is yes, then we need not go to Section 9. If the answer to this question is no, we would go to Section 9 and then test certain other parameters. For instance, whether the situs of the brand is in India or not. The question becomes interesting because the term accrual has been a very, very, I would say, complicated term for so many years, ever since it has been put on the statute book, You have especially the Supreme Court decision in the case of Performing Rights Society, where in a funny facts, the Supreme Court said that the income naturally accrues in India and therefore one need not really Section 9. The facts of Performing Rights Society very briefly was that there was an Indian client. It took certain IPRs on license from the foreign party, and when those licenses were sold by the foreign parties, the view taken by Supreme Court was that yes, it accrues under India. Normally the view which I believe is the correct view is that merely because certain asset is utilized in India, that does not normally mean that the income naturally accrues in India. Income would accrue in India if there is a right to receive income in India, and if the situs of that asset along with the corporate seal, I'll right now not go into pluses and minuses because of paucity of time, I'll just bounce off my views, is in India. Hence, my view would be, and yeah, hence my this is working. This is better. Hence, my view would be that the income should not normally accrue under Section 5, subject to certain controversial decisions. Then you have to test it under Section 9, whether the income is deemed to accrue under Section 9 in the hands of the Japanese company. Section 9 talks about all income accruing directly or indirectly from any business connection in India, any source of income in India, or any asset, capital asset situated in India. Now, first is while there is a business connection, but the moment you go under business connection, a business connection is not enough. You need to have a business activity. Only if there is a business activity would there be certain portion of the income taxable. Now, a transfer of brand for the Indian territory would not result into any business activity for that transaction per se, and hence the parameter of business connection becomes irrelevant. The only parameter which is worthy of debate is whether the source of income is in India and whether the property is situated in India, or whether the property is situated in India. Very interestingly, on this source of income, you have numerous decisions. For instance, Asia said source means an activity which gives rise to income. There is a Madras High Court decision in 262 ITR which says sources where the customers are situated. My personal view would be based on the Bombay High Court decision in the case of Kusumben Mahadevia, which says that sources where either the activity arises or where either the asset is situated. And very interestingly, the Supreme Court in the case of Anglo-French textile had made a very beautiful distinction between source of income and place where income accrues. Place where income accrues is relevant for the purpose of normal accrual under Section 5, whereas source of income is relevant for the purpose of Section 9. Very interestingly, Supreme Court said that there can be only one source of income. However, there could be multiple places where income accrues. For instance, if there is a manufacturing in India and marketing outside India, then the place where the income accrues should be divided into marketing outside India and manufacturing in India. But the source of income would only be one, which would need to be decimated by way of facts of the case. This question also recently in the case of Havels by the Delhi High Court has been debated a lot, where effectively they have again gone to the basic principle enunciated by the Bombay High Court. Where does the activity, where is the activity carried out, and where is really the asset situated? And hence the activity absolutely was carried out outside India vis-a-vis this transaction, and hence the question only comes where is the asset situated. And this limb also matches with the last limb of Section 9 to say that where is the situs of the brand. We have two decisions in this context, one of Pfizer, one of Foster's. Both decisions have been given by the Authority for Advanced Meal. Basically, they have taken a view that because you have been utilizing the brand for a considerable time in the territory of India, and that continues at the point of time the sale was made, the situs of that brand should be considered in India. I am in agreement with that view. In fact, in Pfizer, very beautifully what they had done was before the brand transfer, they had terminated the brand usage agreement, and the transfer happened after that, And the view taken by the AAR was that because at the point of time of transfer, there was no existence of the brand usage agreement, the situs cannot be said to be in India, and in that way they had kind of obviated tax. So I would believe that this transaction which is being carried out by the Japanese company with the Indian subsidiary will be regarded as income deemed to accrue in India. However, very interestingly, under section 47 clause 4, there is an exemption vis-a-vis a transaction carried out between a parent company and a wholly owned Indian subsidiary where the asset is being acquired by the Indian subsidiary. The condition for that exemption is that 100% of the shares should be owned by the parent company or its nominees. In our case, we can presume that 100% of the shares are owned by the Japanese company, and if so, clearly this transaction, even if somebody says is deemed to accrue under section 9, would be considered as exempt under section 47, because that transaction would not be regarded as transfer, and hence the charge under section 45 would fail. We have a very interesting decision of AR in the case of RTS, which in a similar case they said, sorry, exemption is not available. They used a very interesting argument. They said the wording says 100% of the shares by the parent company or the nominees. So either the parent company should own 100% or the nominees should own 100%. However, in practice, the nominee will always hold one or two shares. So 100% is always owned by the parent company and the nominees. So, the AR took a very literal reading of that provision and denied the exemption. And I do not believe there is a single instance where the 100% can be owned by a single parent company or by nominees altogether. So, with due respect, the decision of the AR seems to be absolutely incorrect. The exemption is also subject to the condition that this relationship of 100% should continue for a period of 8 years under section 47A. The fact that this company would be merged into another subsidiary, Pralogan, might give rise to a question whether this condition of remaining a subsidiary for 8 years would be satisfied or not. One argument is that yes, it is not satisfied and hence this transaction no longer is exempt under 47. The other argument is that because of the merger, the legal existence no longer remains, and therefore this condition is impossible to satisfy. I believe it would be a very litigative. The general view which we are taking is on merger there is a high exposure that you would be regarded as having violated the condition of 47A, and hence there may not be a scope to have support completely on section 47. Very interestingly, under the India-Japan treaty, while capital gain on shares are taxable, however, capital gain on any property other than shares are considered as exempt, subject to certain exceptions like immovable property, property relating to a permanent establishment, etc. So you may also rely on a treaty for this particular transaction really to say that yes, it is exempt under the treaty. So that is as regards to taxability in the hands of nobody. The second question comes, what happens in the hands of Pratishta? Clearly it would record it as an intangible asset, claim depreciation, etc. etc. A very interesting question here happens is that if Pratishta has overpaid for their trademark, then applying the transfer pricing regulations, the excess would be ignored for the purpose of claiming depreciation. However, if it has underpaid, then there cannot be any adverse implications in the hands of Pratishta. The only question which might then have arisen, assuming this gain was taxable in the hands of the India-Japan treaty, that can it claim any protection on the basis of base erosion test? Of course, today it is exempt. There is no question of really debating whether the Japan company is over-received or under-received. But assuming it was taxable, would you have argued that while I have under-received, the Indian subsidiary is not claiming any tax break, and hence considering the base erosion test, you need not impute that addition in in my hands. While there was one case in many years back in the case of instrumentarium supporting this argument based on certain specific facts, more and more high courts are taking a view that this concept of base erosion, whereby the company would argue that you cannot add in my books because the recipient is not, sorry, not the recipient, the payer is not taking a deduction, no longer holds good because it's not really stated. So this base erosion test is to a great extent, I would believe, a very litigative area. The very interesting question which might arise when Pratishta is merging into Praloban is whether this goodwill which is recorded on merger, is it subject to section 32, would it be regarded as an intangible assets, would it be eligible for depreciation? If one reads the wordings of the Supreme Court decision in Smith Securities, it seems to suggest yes, Supreme Court has confirmed that there is a strong case to contend goodwill being regarded as an intangible asset for the purpose of section 32, and hence you should be eligible for depreciation. A couple of issues arise. In that particular decision, Supreme Court did not consider a particular section, section 43, subsection 1, explanation 7, which basically talked about the fact that whenever there is a merger, the WTV in the hands of Pratishta would be carried to Praloban. And assuming Supreme Court has not considered that particular provision, the first question which arises is whether the Supreme Court decision can be regarded as rendered per incurium, that is rendered without knowledge of certain sections. There is another Supreme Court decisions in the case of Dunlop, in the case of an excise duty matter, where the Supreme Court said that you cannot regard a Supreme Court rendering a decision without any ignorance of the law. So in spite of the fact we may not have expressly cited that in the order, you should still presume we have read the whole Income Tax Act and given the decision with full knowledge, with full wisdom. And therefore this concept of per incurium, while you might apply at high courts or below level, you cannot really apply at a Supreme Court level. So today you have to presume that yes, they had read 43, but they did not put it expressly into the order. And therefore this provision of section 43 should not apply. In any case, there is an argument to say that because this goodwill was not a depreciable asset in the hands of Pratishta, there is no question of it traveling to the books of Praloban and kind of recorded at the same WDV, which is 0. So these are broadly the thoughts vis-a-vis these transactions. There could be some more complexity which arises if at all the income was taxable in the hands of the Japanese company, like the apportionment of cost, etc. But maybe we'll take that into rejoinder.
Yeah, thank you, Vishal. I think they often say that great men think alike or fools seldom differ. So I don't know which one is true, but I think, yeah, I would completely agree with what Vishal has said, and therefore I am not going to repeat the entire what he said in relation to the brand. He already put down the facts before you. So here I think he spoke of section 5 and how first the tax authority could try to tax the transaction under section 5, and then he said under section 9. And he made reference to two rulings there in the context of Pfizer, where there was an outright sale of designs and drawings outside India. I think it was Panama in that particular case, and how in that particular case of the AAR, they said that the situs of the asset was not in India and therefore not taxable in India. So I agree with that. On then the section 9, he then went and elaborated on this whole concept of source and whether the source, what is really the source, and that becomes very important for a lot of us income tax practitioners, because you have an exception under section 917 in relation to a source where the source is outside India and the either you have a business or the source of the income is outside India. So there again he mentioned the ruling of the Delhi High Court in the case of Havels, which said that the source really is the activity there. And I would believe, as he concluded, that the AAR ruling in the case of Foster's actually deals with this particular issue in great amount of depth, where they had this license given to SKOL, which was the Indian brewery, which was making the beer, and then there was a termination of license and probably assignment of license to the Indian entity, and the question whether the gain is taxable in India under section 911, because where was the situs of that asset? And there the AAR has made some observations, and some of the observations are that wherever the trademark is registered is not necessarily the situs of the asset. So the trademark registration probably is not really conclusive. In this case, we have that the trademark is also additionally registered, as I said, both in Navi Mumbai and probably in Delhi. And the fact that you have exploited that trademark, as he said, for making payment of royalty for a period of time. Based on those facts, the AR concluded that there was a capital gain in India on the sale of that particular trademark or brand or whatever it is. And therefore, and in that case, he also then referred to the India-Japan treaty. And as you know, because I'm really expounding this a little bit because Mr. Krishnan mentioned that probably a lot of you are not direct tax practitioners. You have the option of either choosing the domestic law or the treaty, whichever is more beneficial. In the case of Foster's, the India-Australia treaty was separately worded, and they could not argue that the gain was not taxable in India and only taxable in Australia. But under the Japanese treaty, as he mentioned, there is a possibility to make that kind of argument. So probably you could get away with the argument as in the case of Japan, that in terms of the treaty, it's not taxable in India and taxable only in Japan. So to summarize, a capital gain does arise because of the situs of the asset being in India, and the situs is very important, and some important observations in the ruling of Foster on where is the situs of an asset. So as we know in the Vodafone case, they say that the situs of a share is normally located where the share register of the company is situated. And in the context of intangible assets, where is the situs? It is sometimes very difficult to know what the situs of an asset is. And here, since they said that it was being exploited in India, there was a payment which was being made, and hence the situs was in India. There was earlier a ruling, before these two rulings, in one of the earliest AAR rulings, which is called the Whirlpool ruling, but which has not been called Whirlpool because that time they used to not refer to names of companies, and they called it AAR 228 ITR something, 487, whatever it is. So again, an interesting issue had arisen, again of a trademark which was sold. And the question was something very similar, that Whirlpool India was making payments of royalties, and therefore the question was whether there was a taxable transaction in India. And that for the first time there was this question, whether a payment from one NR to another NR in relation to an asset which was really situated in India could give rise to a taxable transaction. So also taking that supports the view that probably the transaction was taxable in India. Another angle, just for your kind of observation, is sometimes tax authorities have also tried to say, is this a capital gain, or can you also tax it under section 916? Because under section 916, transfer of all or any rights in relation to a patent, trademark, or whatever the intellectual property can give rise to a royalty. And sometimes in some tax treaties, if that payment is contingent upon the productivity, it can be so taxed, not be taxed. So one is the capital gains aspect, and one is the royalty aspect as well. But I agree that it will be more appropriate here that it should be capital gains. Pfizer, the ruling of the AR in the Pfizer distinguished both and said it is properly capital gains and not really royalty. Then coming to the next limb of arguments, where he spoke about the section 47(4), and he spoke about the AR ruling in the case of the buyback of shares. And he referred to the AAR, how the AAR actually was, I wouldn't say pig-headed, because it will become, it will be contempt of court or so, something like that. But the AAR actually was looking at a buyback transaction. In the context of that, probably this was a passing observation that they made. They said that this was largely going to be covered by the buyback provision, these are specific provisions, and in order to justify that, they also probably brought in this theory of entirely by the share capital, by the shareholder and the nominees. So my belief is that that was only passing observation in order to support a conclusion which they probably already was preordained or pre-reached by the AAR. So yeah, 47(4) can apply in case of a subsidiary. And on the third aspect which he referred to in relation to the claim for the depreciation on the goodwill, And I also believe that in case of Smith Securities, the Supreme Court has very clearly said that you will get depreciation, and goodwill is also an intangible, so it's important business or commercial right per se. You should be eligible to the depreciation. The point that he made in reference to the expression 7 to section 43(1), and as he correctly pointed out, you are supposed to, it is an accepted principle of interpretation, the Supreme Court is supposed to have looked at all the principles. You are not supposed to infer that the Supreme Court has missed out a particular section. And by coincidence, I think yesterday Tax Sutra seems to have reported a Bombay Tribunal decision, which was argued by Mr. Rajan Vora. I didn't see the name because I was out traveling yesterday. But they have accepted that the payment of goodwill in the course of an amalgamation transaction, depreciation will be allowable. So it is also my belief that you should be in a position to get depreciation on that transaction.
Just quickly, 1 minute summarizing. What was the payment which is made towards royalty would be covered under royalty, correct? Tax would be deducted. The sale of brand would be considered capital gain. You have option of treating that subsidiary, but there is an issue there. But you may look at Indo-Japan, Article 13, and then say that it will be out of the tax. As regards the cost of the brand which is acquired, there is depreciation, and good will also be considered. But before I pass on to the one thing, trademark may not be registered also. There is a passing of trademark, even by the general concept of trademark being understood, one cannot pass. So it is not registered. Would you say then that there is the entire sale of brand does not have anything concerning India, and it will not happen? Does it make a difference that says the usage of the trademark in India is important? The fact that there is an agreement to use the trademark, or the fact that it is registered is important?
Yeah, so I think it should be the use of trademark. In any case, trademark is protected
what-
under the common law.
Which is also what the ruling of Foster seems to say. So you're talking of the passing of
Yeah,
cases.
but,
where you pass
one
off.
may not register the trademark because one is anyway protected. So does it make a difference in direct tax that you are not registered, and hence the very fact that usage by general trade, that itself gives rights?
Usage and exploitation in these cases of a source of income from India, where there was.
So there is an agreement, prior agreement for exploitation. I think Parag, you have to start according to the, yeah. You start.
These guys going to start.
Oh, no problem, between the two of you.
So I think what is important here in this transaction, the facts are quite clear. They are not as complex as the first one. The taxes which we need to discuss, and all of you will agree, is one is VAT, the other is service tax, and possibly customs, because there is a foreign party. I think on the first transaction that the Japanese company owns the trademark and brand, and they have given this on a transfer of right to use basis to the Indian company. Whether the tax will be applicable under VAT or under service tax or not. It's a transfer of right to use, and therefore both VAT and service tax both are applicable. But how they are applicable, where they are applicable, and what is the situs of this transaction is something which we need to discuss. As far as VAT is concerned, I think all of us are aware the key 4 or 5 judgments which have to be discussed in this is one is the Vikas Sales Corporation, 20th Century, Ambalal Sarabhai, and the latest one is Dufar Maharashtra Tribunal judgment. I think these 4 or 5 judgments helps us to decide what is the basis and how the taxability of intangibles would arise. Now, one very important point which I would like to make here is that in Maharashtra, I think under the schedule of the intangibles, they have defined 12 or 13 items. So only those items are taxable. If I look at it on an all India basis, the VAT legislations of an all India basis, I think Maharashtra is the only state where you have these definitions that only these 12 or 13 items are taxable. If you go to any other state's definition, then it says all intangibles or any intangibles. It doesn't define which type of an intangible will be taxable. So it is very important when you are evaluating intangible transactions to look into whether first of all it is taxable or not under the schedule, and for that purpose Maharashtra is very important. So having said that, brands and trademarks, all of them are taxable in Maharashtra. So otherwise they are taxable